Good evening and welcome to The Strand. I'm Christina Foxley, the Director of Events, and I'm thrilled to introduce cartoonist and teacher Paul Karasik here tonight to share his work on the second volume of Fletcher Hanks' cartoons, You Shall Die by Your Own Evil Creation. Karasik was a student of Will Eisner, Harvey Kurtzman, and Art Spiegelman at School of Visual Arts and now teaches at RISD. He was the associate editor of Spiegelman and Françoise Mouly's Raw, and in 1994 collaborated with David Mazzucchelli on the adaptation of Paul Auster's novel City of Glass, which was cited by the Comics Journal as one of the 100 best comics of the 20th century. In addition to speaking about discovering the work of forgotten comics genius Fletcher Hanks, the man whom R. Crumb called a twisted dude, Paul is going to present the Fletcher Hanks experience, an illustrated tour over the brutally surreal Hanks mindscape narrated by the late Fletcher Hanks Jr. Following his presentation, Paul will take your questions. We'll be walking around with the microphone, so please wait for that before you speak. And then he'll sign copies of his book for you, which you can purchase downstairs on your way out of the store. Please join me in welcoming Paul Karasik to the Strand.
Thank you, Christina. Well, it's a thrill to be here at the Strand, a place where I spent many an afternoon and many a paycheck. Fletcher Hanks. Who was Fletcher Hanks? In the earliest days of the comic book, a no-holds-barred atmosphere exists where anything goes and anything did go. It went crazy. Fletcher Hanks worked for the first 3 years of the comic book and then disappeared. Nobody knew what happened to Fletcher Hanks until very recently. In those first 3 years, Fletcher Hanks worked on a series of different characters for a series of different publishers. One of the reasons why his work is not very well known today is because Hanks worked for third-rate and even fourth-rate publishers, creating characters that did not go on to become licensable commodities such as Batman and Superman, but working for Fox or Fiction House, comic book companies that barely existed. He worked on characters Stardust, Fantomah, Space Smith, some characters no one ever heard of again. But he worked very hard, and in 3 years he created 51 stories. It says 48, but the real tally is 51. His most famous character is Stardust, the super wizard. Stardust, whose vast knowledge of interplanetary science has made him the most remarkable man that ever lived, devotes his abilities to racket busting. What are you laughing? I mean, like, if you were the most remarkable man who ever lived, wouldn't you devote your talents to racket busting? I know I would. I have no idea what's going on in this picture, and I don't think Fletcher Hanks did either. Here's Fantomah, the mystery woman of the jungle. Fantomah, the most marvelous woman ever known, has such a remarkable insight that she can see all that ever happens in Jungle Land. I'm not sure exactly where Jungle Land is. I think it's west of Kenya or something. Fantomah is an interesting character, as is Stardust. These heroes are omnipotent overseers who look down at humanity with a sort of distant disdain. They've got ability to see all and know all. Everything that occurs on Earth, they are aware of. Fantomah, in particular, is an intriguing character. Those skulls represent, on either side of her, represent her alter ego. When Fantomah sees evil going on Earth, this is what happens to her. She starts out looking like, Jean Harlow or somebody, and then ends up looking like Skeletor. Org, your time has arrived. Now you will pay a dreadful penalty. And then she stays that way for the rest of the story while she tortures Org, and then eventually she turns back into Jean Harlow at the end when Jungle Land is once again safe. Just to give you a taste for a typical Fletcher Hanks story, I'm going to share with you an abridged version of one of my favorite tales. I want you to bear in mind the year this next story was done, about 1940. Okay, so the first Superman comic, Action Comics, 1938. So comics have only been around for a year and a few months. And nobody knew what a comic book was back then. Comic books just appeared and suddenly sold like crazy. A fantastic way for publishers who had been publishing pulp magazines and pornography to now wrest dimes from small, unsuspecting children. And publishers appeared overnight and had these cartoonists. Anyone wanted to be a cartoonist in 1940, whether you had any talent or not, could get a job working for perhaps Fox or Fiction House doing stories like Fantomah or Stardust. A lot of people look at Fletcher Hanks stories and say, oh, you know, he's a naive artist or he's an outsider artist. In fact, when the first book came out, many people referred to him as the Ed Wood of comics. It's a kind of a nice way to begin to understand the work of Fletcher Hanks by calling him the Ed Wood of comics. They certainly have a lot in common. But Hanks was neither a naive artist nor was he an outsider. He was right there at the beginning of the comic book industry, and he had always wanted to become a cartoonist. As a matter of fact, one of the pleasant surprises of going back and creating this second compilation of Fletcher Hanks stories was that I found from his family actual examples of drawings that Hanks had done as a student. He had taken a correspondence course where he learned how to become a cartoonist from getting assignments from W.L. Evans cartooning school in Ohio, and he'd do the anatomy lesson there and send it in, and then the teacher would make notations on it and send it back. You know, he was trained. He wanted to become a cartoonist. When 1939 rolled around, here was his great opportunity to become a cartoonist. And he was far from inept. The stories surrounding these Fletcher Hanks stories are they're crude in comparison to Hanks' storytelling skills, which are very good, and his drawing is very solid. So that's important to bear in mind. When you see these, you'll see they're twisted, they're weird, the character's oddly proportioned, but he was not a know-nothing. This guy was a know-something. I apologize to purists before we start the story. Now, many people don't like to see just isolated frames or stories truncated, but if I read you a whole Fletcher Hanks story, there wouldn't be time to look at some other stuff. So I kind of boiled it down to the essence of a Fantomah story. Fantomah, the most remarkable woman ever known, has such strange powers and insight that she foresees all that is to happen in connection with jungle life. So there she is with her alter ego. You know, she's going to get pissed by the end of this story, right? Okay, so there she is. She sees in a far-off laboratory a famous scientist working on a secret serum of great power. The serum is at last perfected. Now I'll be able to take apes and give them brains superior to any man's. I'll make a race of beastmen with intelligence enough to conquer the world. Through my serum I can control them all. Thus I shall become the head of a great world empire. 2 weeks later, fast plane heads for the dense jungle. We must find the huge Gorgon gorillas. The necessary preparations are made, and the safari gets underway. Fantomah, invisible to them, follows their course. We'll soon see the Gorgon gorillas, Doctor. Be careful not to hurt them in any manner. Fantomah has already seen what's going on. She's keeping an eye on these guys. A trained guide uses his reed pipe, an artificial gorilla call, to attract the big apes. From out of the dense forest comes a group of the huge gorillas. The trap is in their path. Look, Mac, we should capture several. The gorillas finally reach the trap. We have trapped 4 of them, Doctor. Fine, now I'll make the experiment. I'd like to point out to cartoonists in the audience that if you ever decide to try to do a superhero story, it's a really good thing to set it in the jungle, because then you can draw lots of foliage and you don't have to draw so many bodies. Remember also, Fletcher Hanks was drawing on the clock here. 51 stories in 3 years, that's more than 1 story a month. So, you know, he had found interesting ways of creating some shortcuts. The skilled trappers quickly seize a foot. In the next instance, an injection of the secret serum is cleverly